In the year 2001, China entered the World Trade Organization. It was a bureaucratic step that had taken 15 years of negotiations. There were no fanfares, no historic speeches. But what happened afterward was the greatest economic transformation of the modern era. Over the next 2 decades, more than 800 million Chinese people were lifted out of extreme poverty. China went from being a poor agrarian country to the world's second-largest economy. And the price the rest of the world paid for practically everything, from t-shirts to computers, fell spectacularly. At the same time, industrial communities in Europe and America emptied. Factories closed. Jobs evaporated. And the middle class of the rich world began to feel that globalization was not working for them. Both things happened simultaneously. Both are true. And together, they defined the era of hyperglobalization. So far we have traced the history of trade from ancient caravans to the institutions of GATT and the WTO. Today we arrive at the most intense period of globalization the world has ever known, the 90s and 2000s. It was an era in which the Berlin Wall fell, China opened up, the internet connected the planet, and supply chains became truly global. Journalist Thomas Friedman summed it up in a phrase that became famous: the world is flat. Everything is connected. Distances no longer matter. But, as we will see, the world was never entirely flat. And distances kept mattering far more than globalization's enthusiasts wanted to admit. To understand hyperglobalization, you have to remember where the world stood in 1989. The Soviet Union was about to crumble. China had been reforming its economy under Deng Xiaoping for a decade but remained a relatively closed economy. India was mired in its import substitution model. Latin America was just emerging from the lost decade of the 80s. In a few years, everything changed. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 integrated Eastern Europe into the global economy. Hundreds of millions of workers entered the world market. India liberalized its economy in 1991, abandoning decades of protectionism. And China, after years of gradual reform, culminated its opening with WTO entry in 2001. Suddenly, the world's effective labor force doubled. Billions of people who had been outside the global trade system entered it. And they were willing to work for wages far lower than workers in rich countries. At the same time, new technologies made it possible to coordinate production on a global scale. The internet enabled instant communication. Standardized shipping containers, in use since the 60s, made maritime transport cheap. Cargo planes moved high-value components at speeds unimaginable a few decades earlier. All of this combined to create something new: global supply chains. If you want to understand 21st century globalization, look at your phone. An iPhone is designed in Cupertino, California. But its components come from 43 countries. The processors are made in Taiwan by TSMC. The OLED screens come from Samsung in South Korea. The camera sensors are from Sony in Japan. Rare earth metals are extracted from mines in Australia, Congo, and Madagascar. Final assembly is done mostly in China, at Foxconn factories employing hundreds of thousands of workers. No single country could make an iPhone on its own. The product is, literally, the sum of dozens of nations' specializations. This is hyperglobalization in its purest form. It is no longer about one country making a product and exporting it to another. It is about the manufacturing itself being spread across multiple countries. Each country contributes the link in the chain where it has a comparative advantage. The result is extraordinarily efficient. Prices for electronics, clothing, and many consumer goods have fallen steadily for decades. Consumers in the developed world enjoy material abundance without precedent. But that efficiency has a counterpart: fragility. When every link in the chain is in a different country, a problem at any point can paralyze the entire system. As the world discovered brutally in 2020. In 2012, Serbian-American economist Branko Milanovic published a graph that became famous as the elephant curve. Using global income data from 1988 to 2008, it showed who had won and who had lost from globalization. The graph is shaped like an elephant, with a high back and a trunk that rises at the end. Each point on the horizontal axis represents a global income group, from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right. The big winners were 2 groups. The first, Asia's middle classes, especially China and India. Hundreds of millions of people who went from poverty to the middle class. They are the elephant's back, income growth of 60, 70, 80% over 20 years. The second, the global super-rich. The richest 1% in the world, at the tip of the elephant's trunk. Their incomes also grew spectacularly. And the losers? The middle and working classes of the rich countries. Those at the dip between the back and the trunk. Their incomes barely grew or even stagnated for 2 decades. The elephant curve tells a story that is uncomfortable for everyone. For globalization enthusiasts, it shows that hundreds of millions were lifted from poverty. That is undeniable and extraordinary. For critics, it shows that the Western middle class paid the price. That is also undeniable. If you remove 3 countries from the graph, China, the United States, and Japan, the elephant shape almost disappears. What looks like a global phenomenon is, to a large extent, the story of how China integrated into the world economy and what effect that had on Western middle classes. There is an aspect of globalization that gets less attention: the movement of people. 21st century globalization liberalized the movement of goods, services, and capital. But the movement of people remained enormously restricted. Economists estimate that if barriers to migration were eliminated, the effect on global wealth would be far greater than the elimination of all trade tariffs combined. Workers who migrate from poor countries to rich countries multiply their productivity simply by being in an environment with better infrastructure, stronger institutions, and more available capital. But migration generates political resistance that trade in goods does not. A container of cheap t-shirts arrives at a port and nobody protests. An immigrant family arrives in a neighborhood and politics is transformed. The asymmetry is revealing. The world opened borders for merchandise and money but kept them closed for people. And that asymmetry is one of the great contradictions of globalization. Hyperglobalization changed the daily lives of billions of people, often without them being aware of it. A middle-class family in Madrid buys clothing cheaper than 30 years ago. Eats food imported from all over the world. Has a phone with components from 43 countries. Their level of material consumption is, in absolute terms, extraordinary. But perhaps one of the parents works in a sector exposed to international competition and has not seen their real salary increase in a decade. Perhaps the other works in a precarious job that used to be stable. And perhaps their children will have less economic security than they had. In Shenzhen, China, a family that 30 years ago lived in a rural village now has electricity, running water, education for their children, and access to consumer goods their parents could not have imagined. Their life has improved spectacularly. But perhaps they work 12 hours a day in a factory. Perhaps they live far from their family because the residence system prevents them from accessing public services in the city where they work. Globalization improved the lives of some and worsened the lives of others, and in many cases it did both to the same person. 3 ideas to take away from this episode. First, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the opening of China, and the technological revolution created an era of hyperglobalization between the 90s and 2010. Supply chains became truly global, with products incorporating components from dozens of countries. Second, Milanovic's elephant curve shows the winners and losers. Asian middle classes and the global super-rich gained enormously. The middle and working classes of rich countries stagnated. Third, globalization liberalized the movement of goods, services, and capital, but kept the movement of people restricted. That asymmetry is one of its greatest contradictions. Globalization made things cheaper. But cheaper for whom? Behind every bargain there is a cost someone else is paying. Factories that collapse. Workers who cannot live on their wages. Polluted seas where the rich world's ships go to die. That, next time.